Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 22871 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a revised business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 22871 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is consideration of business motion 22841, also in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, and this is about committee meeting times. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion? Thank you very much, Minister. And again, no members indicated they wish to speak on this motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 22841 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. Normally we would turn to topical questions, but we have a different order of business today to accommodate members of the Finance Committee in particular. And we're going to move to a statement by Kate Forbes on the Scottish Budget update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions following her statement, so I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, thank you. This is a welcome opportunity to provide an update linked to publication of the autumn budget revision, which was laid on Thursday, the 24th of September, and related budget matters. It continues my commitment to engage Parliament on the budget process and on the funding provided to support the COVID-19 response. I also take the opportunity to offer some thoughts in response to the Chancellor's statement last week and his decision to scrap the autumn budget from the UK Government. The autumn budget revision is the second of 3 formal in-year amendments planned to the Scottish Budget for 2020-21, reflecting the Scottish Government's financial response to COVID-19. It remains a snapshot of a dynamic funding position, but brings the total Scottish Government financial response to COVID-19 to over £6.5 billion. That was around £4 billion at the summer budget revision and £2.5 billion here, with final allocations planned to be set out in February in the spring budget revision. The ABR allocates £2.55 billion of COVID-19 and other funding changes. It's being funded through deploying £2.4 billion of Barnett consequentials, £142 million of reprioritisation of existing expenditure and £30 million of Scotland Reserve drawdowns for capital expenditure. The largest element, £1.84 billion of Barnett consequentials, is allocated to health and social care, bringing total health funding on COVID-19 to over £2.4 billion and reflecting that this crisis is first and foremost a health crisis. £222 million of resource consequentials are allocated to transport, £190 million is for business, employment and cultural support, and £119 million is for education and skills. The ABR also allocates the majority of capital expenditure from the £230 million economic stimulus package announced in June. That leaves just over £500 million of COVID-19 resource consequentials formally unallocated, but I can remind the opposition members who appear to be confused about the nature of a budget revision that this funding is fully committed to the COVID response. It will be formally allocated through the spring budget revision. A budget revision is a retrospective budget process. The residual Scotland Reserve position is currently £220 million in total. Although not formally allocated here, the remaining consequentials are already being redeployed against existing high-priority commitments, and there is no available headroom. For example, our commitment to provide funding for those on lower incomes who are required to self-isolate, and essential support we know is required in sustaining our transport networks. We all want to do more, and I am facing calls to fund additional measures from all parties. In the absence of any further UK consequential funding, the only way of supporting additional commitments is through further reprioritisation of existing funding that we know is required to support vital public services. And that's why I continue to press the case for additional borrowing powers and other fiscal flexibilities with the UK Government, powers that are essential in enabling this Government to do more to maintain a Scottish approach to supporting the COVID-19 response and to assist in the management of the overall budget position. Now, we are not waiting for the UK Government to act, but instead have got on with the business of investing in the economy with a view to providing clarity to businesses and supporting economic recovery. Just last week, we published the draft Infrastructure Investment Plan as well as the Capital Spending Review Framework document. Together, those publications provide detail of future capital spending plans which will aid our response to the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic and give much-needed confidence to key sectors of the Scottish economy. The draft Infrastructure Investment Plan sets out a clear vision to support and to enable an inclusive net zero emissions economy. It includes the details of around £24 billion of major projects and national programmes that we can confirm now, with more to be added in future years. Infrastructure has a vital role to play in supporting jobs and in helping businesses and communities to adapt and to recover from the impact of COVID-19. Moreover, the package of investments set out in the draft response to Scotland's economic, social and environmental needs, and it supports sustainable and inclusive growth for all. The framework gives the basis for publishing a full capital spending review later this year, which will provide multi-year capital budget allocations for the Scottish Government and other public sector bodies. We have done this despite continuing uncertainty about the UK Government's own forward spending plans. And coming on to that, the Chancellor's decision to scrap this autumn's UK budget is extremely concerning news. The Scottish budget envelope still depends heavily on the block grant set by the UK budget and on UK tax policy. Without that tax policy and the other announcements of a UK budget, the Scottish budget for next year, on which vital public services depend, will be based on provisional and partial figures and therefore subject to unnecessary uncertainty and risk. That is no way to set a multi-billion-pound budget on which the communities and the businesses of this country rely. We faced a similar situation this year when the UK budget was not set until March, and members across the chamber, no matter how much they might defend the UK government today, know full well that last year's delay was deeply problematic for our budget setting and scrutiny processes. The situation we now face is far, far worse, compounded by the financial challenges of COVID-19, the potential for the UK government to make substantial changes to tax and spending, and the uncertainty surrounding Brexit. I think it's completely unacceptable that Scotland and the other devolved governments are being put in that position once again. And together with the finance ministers of Wales and Northern Ireland, I've written to the Chancellor to register our concerns about this delay and the prolonged uncertainty about the scope and the content of the UK Comprehensive Spending Review. This again underlines the real need for us to have full financial powers to ensure that we're not adversely affected by UK budgetary decisions or indeed non-decisions. Whether it's Brexit uncertainty, the lack of clarity on COVID funding or scrapping the autumn's UK budget, our whole budget process is at the mercy of the dysfunction of Westminster. And the Chancellor's winter economy statement provided helpful clarity on his next steps. I welcome the extension of support for some individuals and businesses, but it was clear weeks ago to nearly everybody else, business leaders, manufacturers, trade unions and political parties across this chamber, that either an extension of the existing measures or successor arrangements were essential to prevent unnecessary economic damage and protect livelihoods. And while the Chancellor has dithered, many businesses have already issued redundancy notices. The Job Support Scheme is a poor and a narrow substitute for the Job Retention Scheme. The Treasury's own illustration makes clear that the scale of their contribution to supporting individuals has plummeted, with the burden falling on hard-pressed employers to provide the majority of the support. And to quote the Institute of Fiscal Studies, this is significantly less generous than the furlough scheme. A lot of these workers who are not working at all are likely now to lose their jobs. And the Scottish Tourism Alliance has also stated that employers cannot afford to pay staff when there is no work, so we can still expect to see mass redundancies. And so I am under no illusions. Despite these announcements, jobs will be lost, the economy will be more fragile, and the recovery is going to be challenging. And so, Presiding Officer, as I conclude, I'll continue to seek to engage Parliament at every step of our fiscal response to COVID-19. The autumn budget revision and the draft infrastructure investment plan is part of that transparent process. However, I believe the Chancellor's statement on Thursday was a missed opportunity, and I also believe that we need the clarity that an autumn budget would provide. The measures so far don't allow us to tailor our response to COVID's impact on the economy. The UK Government's continued failure to provide proportionate fiscal flexibility, such as borrowing powers, prevents this Government and indeed this Parliament from acting in a way to deliver the support that we all believe is necessary. Our ambition remains to eliminate COVID-19 in Scotland and for the Scottish economy to return to delivering prosperity and growth. And unfortunately, under the current arrangements imposed on our budget approach and timetable, our response to this crisis is overly dependent on that of the UK Government. So the lack of an autumn UK budget increases the funding uncertainty for our decision-making at a time when taxpayers, communities and our public services most need clarity. Like all governments, we're facing pressure to act now, to go further, to provide additional support, but we don't have the tools that allow us to do that. We don't have the clarity we need on UK tax and spending to support our budget planning into next year, and it does not seem credible to me that the UK Government refuses to accept the case for these routine, basic fiscal powers given these exceptional times, powers that this Parliament has overwhelmingly supported in the past.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. First question from Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advanced sight of her statement, although it is disappointing that she has now fully adopted the grievance agenda of all her Cabinet colleagues. The Finance Secretary complains the UK budget is being delayed, seemingly oblivious to the fact that we have a global health emergency wreaking havoc with economies and public finances across the world. And of course, the Scottish Government were able to set a budget in similar circumstances just earlier this year. So is there any reason to believe that the current Finance Secretary will prove less capable in this regard than her predecessor in office? But can I ask two questions of the Cabinet Secretary in relation to the detail of her statement? She referred to the unprecedented £6.5 billion guarantee of additional spending from the UK Government. And she said that £500 million of that was formally unallocated. Can I ask her how much of that £500 million is currently unspent in the Scottish Government budget? Is it the entire amount that's unspent? And if all that money is fully committed, to where is it committed? And when will we be given all this detail? And secondly, can I ask her how much has already been reprioritised within existing Scottish Government budget to addressing the COVID-19 situation?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, in terms of the substance of the question, it's precisely because of the global pandemic that I am appealing to the UK Government for the clarity so that we can provide clarity to taxpayers, our communities and our public services. This is not about the Scottish Government feeling like it hasn't got advance notice from the UK Government. This is about the need to set a multi-billion-pound budget on which our NHS relies and not having the certain figures that we require this autumn. Now, I'm in conversation with Treasury in the hope that they will be able to provide some form of accurate figures in autumn, because I cannot set a budget on the basis of estimates. Our taxpayers rely on precise figures, not on estimates. And if you look at just one basic example, when it comes to non-domestic rates, the Tories will know that in terms of our interventions on non-domestic rates this year to provide support to businesses, that was reliant on consequentials that came. Now, to set a budget before we know what the UK Government is going to do on tax, it makes it very difficult for us to go further because we are not allowed to overspend our budget. That is not a point of grievance, that is a point of fact, which I would hope all members recognise. In terms of the two specific questions of the 500 million, all of that money is deployed, I can say with complete certainty. All of it is deployed. In terms of the full raft of details, that will be confirmed in the spring budget revision, which should be published in February. But the examples I would give are the continued support for the transport systems, continued support for things like the self-isolation payments, but every single penny of that has been committed and will be formally allocated in the spring budget revision. In the same way as we did not formally allocate everything in the summer budget revision, but I have now provided an update, the same will apply to the spring budget revision. In terms of reprioritisation, we have reprioritised £142 million.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Let me thank the Cabinet Secretary for an advance copy of her statement and start on a note of consensus, because I do recognise the significant difficulty faced by the Scottish Government as a result of the decision by the Chancellor to delay the UK autumn budget statement and, in turn, the Scottish Parliament to do its job of scrutiny. Turning to the autumn budget revision and the £537 million in Barnett consequentials for COVID-19 that has not been, to use the Cabinet Secretary's words, formally allocated. If the Cabinet Secretary is telling us that there is no headroom, all the money is deployed, all has been allocated, then she should be telling us now where that money is going to. And specifically, can she tell me how much will be given to local government, who only last week reported a budget gap of some £350 million, much of which is COVID-related?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for starting on that point of consensus, which I hope we can continue throughout the budget process. In terms of the over £500 million, I would remind members of the way in which the most recent consequentials were allocated to us, which was as a guarantee, the £800 million. And that is with the understanding that our transport costs, are, in terms of continued subsidies to rail and bus, are going to continue. And she also talked about local government, which is another good example of funding that hasn't been formally allocated, but that we have entered into agreements with COSLA to ensure that they get additional money. She will know that we've already committed £382.2 million of direct funding, £257.6 million of which was approved by Parliament on the 27th of June, and the remaining £124.6 million was to be allocated following agreement on the distribution methodology with COSLA. We are currently engaging with COSLA to finalise the details of the lost income scheme, which is worth up to an estimated £90 million, and that sits alongside £49 million which has been agreed to be passed on to local authorities, and that is part of the lost income scheme. She will also know that I have written to the UK Government to seek clearance on a package of fiscal flexibilities to provide further assistance to local authorities, which certainly my own local leader, who is not an SNP leader, said would be a game changer for council finances.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for the advance statement, which mentions the replacement of the job support scheme in place of the job retention scheme, and the likelihood that that will lead to increased unemployment. It's also likely to lead to increased poverty, because those at the bottom end of the wage scale will be losing income they can ill afford to lose. What impact will that have on the Scottish finances, either through devolved tax take or through uptake and demand for devolved social security and other services? How is it possible to project the impact on the Scottish finances for these changes in time to allocate what is so far formally unallocated, but which we'll hear about in the spring budget revision?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Patrick Harvey makes a good point in terms of the impact on our tax receipts, as well as the increased need for welfare support. He will know that when it comes to setting our budget, one of the reasons why the timetable is so important is that the Fiscal Commission needs enough time in order to provide their own forecasts, which will include the likely impact on tax and on welfare support. But we know that there will be a substantial impact on all the devolved taxes this year, which is something that we're monitoring very carefully, although he'll know that the income tax impact will only materialise in the coming years. In terms of welfare support, it's one of the reasons that very quickly in March we provided additional support to local authorities to be able to provide further support, for example, through welfare. And he will see in the autumn budget revision, and I'm sure we can get into the detail of this in committee next week, that there is transfers related to the Scottish Welfare Fund in this particular autumn budget revision.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. My question is in two parts. Can I press the Finance Secretary as to whether an estimate has been made for the amount given directly to the Treasury, from the Treasury to people and businesses in Scotland under furlough and business support. That estimate was requested on the 23rd of June. And secondly, the Scottish Fiscal Commission's estimates for Scottish tax receipts have led to hundreds of millions of pounds of negative reconciliations. £309 million shortfall next year is really hard. That is money out of the budget. Have the processes been improved to get better estimates? And what other estimates will the Cabinet Secretary use to inform the budget? Cabinet Secretary.
I'm afraid I didn't quite follow the first question, so perhaps I could answer the second one, and then you could, unless you want to clarify what the first question was. I didn't.
Mr. Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. I may have fluffed that slightly. I'm just asking if an estimate has been made by the Scottish Government for the total amount given by the Treasury to support Scottish people and businesses through furlough and business grants.
Cabinet Secretary.
Those are Treasury figures, and they're publicly available. So my understanding is that Treasury provides those figures. We know that 217,000 people in Scotland are still on furlough. That's about 15% of the workforce. So clearly there is still a number of people that are dependent on that furlough support, which will run out at the end of October. And clearly the replacement scheme does not incentivise the resumption of those jobs if there is no work. In terms of the negative reconciliations, the estimates, yes, at the very early stages of the devolution of income tax, clearly all parties were improving the process of forecasting and estimates. I think that's widely accepted. The other point, of course, though, is that it is worrying that next year there will be these negative reconciliations, which will have a significant impact on the Scottish budget, which could be relieved in part if the borrowing powers reflected the need to cover the reconciliations. I am relieved that £309 million is significantly lower than previous estimates, and 300 million of that could be covered by the borrowing powers which were provided for the express purpose of covering negative reconciliations, which are to be expected in the early years of devolving a new tax.
Thank you. Bruce Crawford, who joins us remotely, to be followed by Maurice Golden. Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, President Officer. Firstly, I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary has explained the reality and facts about the autumn budget revisions. The opposition have either fundamental misunderstanding of the financial arrangements in place, or they've been deliberately seeking cheap, baseless headlines. But in regard to the Chancellor's scrapping of the budget, would the Cabinet Secretary please expand on what this could mean for the Scottish budget and vital public services, particularly when we're in the middle of a pandemic and look likely to crash out of the European Union against the wishes of the Scottish people? This is unacceptable.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to Bruce Crawford for that. As he knows full well, budget revisions are predominantly retrospective in nature, and I know that full well, having come before his committee regularly to explain the detail in the budget revisions, and I look forward to further scrutiny. Well, that's maybe too strong a word. I look forward in part to his scrutiny at committee next week. He's right to point out the huge problems that a delay to the UK budget causes, not only to the Parliament, but actually to every public sector body in Scotland. We did face the same situation this year when the UK budget was not set till March. We had to go in advance. It was deeply problematic for our budget setting. All members know that, no matter what side of the chamber that they sit on. It was difficult for scrutiny, but the situation that we now face is further compounded by the financial challenges that Murdo Fraser himself alluded to, the challenges of COVID, the uncertainty surrounding Brexit, the threat of a potential no deal at the end of the year. And ultimately, we need tax policy, and we need understandings of UK spending decisions in order to know what our budget will be based on. I cannot base a budget on provisional figures when the people of this country, the public services in this country, and our taxpayers require certainty.
Thank you. Maurice Golden, to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary is asked to be given full financial powers. In such a scenario, which public services would be cut?
Cabinet Secretary.
If we were given full financial powers, we would be extending the job retention scheme to avoid the cliff edge at the end of this month and ensure that 217,000 people are not currently facing redundancy. And that is how I would use our full financial powers.
Tom Arthur, to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Presiding Officer, the financial resources at our disposal determine to a large extent our ability to respond to the public health crisis of COVID, a public health response that will determine whether people stay safe, healthy, whether they live. Can I therefore ask the Cabinet Secretary what impact the delayed UK budget will have upon the Scottish Government's ability to effectively mount an effective public health response to COVID through the winter?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, last year, ironically, we were continually referred to the Conservative Party manifesto by Treasury officials when asking for any certainty about our budget figures. We don't even have the luxury of a December election when facing this year's budget. So not only are we resorting to guesswork in our total funding envelope, but critically how much funding we can allocate to health services as they continue to respond to the pandemic. And as I've said, that's no way of setting a multi-billion-pound budget. We've committed to passing on every penny of consequential funding that we receive in full, as the autumn budget revision demonstrates. We'll continue to do that. But it is difficult to provide that certainty that everybody needs.
Alec Rowley, to be followed by John Mason.
Presiding Officer, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that, as well as a fiscal response in terms of tackling the economic crisis as a result of COVID, we need a policy response to sit alongside that? Scottish Labour continues to support the Government in making the case for additional borrowing powers and fiscal flexibility within the UK Government. But can I ask, what is the purpose of getting the new resources? Where are the jobs coming from? Where are the jobs that are at risk? And where are the skills gaps within Scotland? And is the Government looking at a regional approach, a joined-up approach with public, private, coming together to actually form a regional strategy in every region of Scotland to create jobs, to invest in jobs, to protect jobs?
Cabinet Secretary.
It's a very good question, and Alex Rowley is right to talk about the policy response that needs to sit alongside that. There are three things that I would refer to, some of which is captured in the autumn budget revision. But the first is how we navigate the next few months of potentially increased localised lockdowns and provide support to businesses that find themselves unable to open. So there's a position there which is that the public health response shouldn't be hampered by the lack of economic levers. The second point is providing support for employment and retraining, which is actually something that was noticeably absent from the Chancellor's winter update last week. So in the autumn budget revision, he will see £90 million of resource funding for employment support and training costs associated with COVID-19. That very point about helping people back into work. And the third element that he'll be aware of, which sees private and public working together very collaboratively, is the jobs guarantee for young people, to ensure that every young person has either access to education, training or a job. And considering how hard hit the lives and the employment prospects of our young people have been through COVID, I think that is particularly important.
Thank you. John Mason, to be followed by Bill Bowman.
Thanks very much. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the new job support scheme, but it seems to me it's quite a blunt instrument, and maybe she could clarify for us, if a particular geographical area was locked down, would she have the powers to help them? Or if a sector is not allowed to reopen, would she have the powers to help them? And if not, what powers would she like to do that?
Cabinet Secretary.
This is very much the powers to be able to fund those interventions, because the nature of having a fixed budget is that to provide additional support in one area, it has to be cut in another. And at a time of emergency, I cannot in good faith see cuts to any of our budget. So the best way of protecting jobs is by extending the furlough scheme. Now, I take the point that doing that perhaps on a partial basis that allows us to tailor it to particular sectors or particular areas is the best way of doing it. Certainly the job support scheme announced by the Chancellor is a poor substitute. It disincentivises employers to bring people back, and it does not remove the risk of redundancy. What we need, what we saw during the localised lockdowns of the last few months, is that because furlough was in place, businesses could access support or refurlough staff. That will not be available going forward, and unless we've got the powers to raise revenue, we are unable to fund our own interventions.
Bill Bowman, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the SNP hopeful and Alex Salmond's former aide, Osama Bouta, when he says that the state literally creates money, it does not need our money? Is this a change to the SNP's economic thinking?
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
I have not read those particular comments, but I suppose if you do want to connect it to the statement, which seems quite removed from this statement, is the fact that very simply in extraordinary times we need extraordinary powers to ensure that we support every business and we support every employee that's currently facing an uncertain future. And what we're asking for is mind-numbingly basic fiscal powers and fiscal flexibilities in order to do that.
Stuart McMillan to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update as to the Scottish Government's latest engagement with the UK Government regarding requests for fiscal flexibilities to be devolved?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I had a meeting with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury last week. There's been no progress on my request for fiscal flexibilities since my last meeting with him in July. I don't think I've had a response to my letter setting out the detail of the flexibilities that I have requested. I'm committed to continuing engagement with Treasury alongside my devolved government counterparts. We are all united in pressing the UK Government for these flexibilities, most of which don't cost the Treasury a penny.
And Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I draw members' attention to my entry in the Register of Interest in relation to my former employment with SFHA? Cabinet Secretary, how can you justify the fact that the capital spending review includes a 30% real terms reduction on the affordable housing supply programme? We have a huge waiting list for appropriate affordable housing and homelessness, so don't we need to protect jobs in the construction industry and support the Scottish economy to get through the pandemic?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, the Infrastructure Investment Plan consultation was published last week, so I'm sure she'd be very welcome to respond to that consultation. But in terms of the capital spending, it's a framework just now. My hope, my sincere hope, is that we have the promised UK Government comprehensive spending review, which will provide additional clarity on precisely what our capital allocations will be for the next 5 years. And that will allow us, alongside the budget, whenever that is, hopefully soon, will allow us to publish a more fulsome capital spending review with exact figures.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our budget statement. We're going to move on shortly to the next item of business, which will be topical questions.